Okay, I think we're ready to get started. If y'all want to grab your seats, we're going to have one final session for our conference. Thank you for sticking around to the end. Had a lot of great speakers and presentations. One final one, we're going to be comparing and contrasting the regulations between the compassionate use program and the hemp industry. You know, we hear a lot about the fact that the hemp industry isn't regulated. Well, it is regulated. We do need to enforce those regulations, and we certainly need some new other regulations put on to the books. We're going to talk about that today, and I'm very pleased to be joined by three women who have worked very hard on cannabis over the years. And Andrea Steele is the principal at the Banks Law Firm, where she leads the firm's cannabis practice. Andrea is a pioneer in the rapidly evolving cannabis industry with deep-rooted knowledge and experience, having been pivotal in securing a number of significant results impacting the industry at both the state and federal level. At the end, we have Dr. Katharine Harris. She's a fellow at the fellow in drug policy at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. Her current research focuses on overdose crisis response strategies and the legalization of medical and adult use cannabis. Susan Hayes, of course, you have heard a lot of this weekend. She is a friend and an ally. She's been a marathon this weekend, moderating panels. She's been integral in the advocacy work that's been going on for the last 10 years, helping to draft policy both on the medical cannabis side as well as the hemp side. And we're grateful to have all three of you here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather.
So we're going to roll through a chart that we all put together that was finalized about 1 a.m.
1 a.m., like that.
We had some concepts, and then we started getting into the nitty gritty, and the lawyers got into it, and really not into it, into the chart.
Right. A little into it. Yeah.
And making sure that we're really addressing the nitty gritty details between these two programs. And let's start with just the basics. We're going to roll through this and allow the conversation to flow where it may, starting with the legality of these products. Susan, we've got marijuana compared to hemp. Let's talk about the legality.
The line between marijuana and hemp is completely arbitrary.
Yep.
And based on not bad data, but misused data. 0.3% Delta-9 THC by dry weight. I'm going to do the fast breakdown on that. Where did that number 0.3 come from? A study that a Canadian Department of Agriculture scientist named Ed Small published in the 70s, where he's trying to guess where is the break between hemp and marijuana. And pretty quickly, he and his colleagues do a follow-up study and say, no, we were wrong about that 0.3 number. It should be a little higher. But everybody in the government's still using it. Second part is the Delta-9. As y'all know, there's plenty of tetrahydrocannabinols in cannabis. To specify Delta-9 is a little wacky. Dry weight. What's the dry weight of a gummy or a beverage? Yet everyone's applying that to product and not just flower. I was joking with Paul from Canada, who was on the prior columns. He said that language is in the Canadian law, except it specifies plant matter. So Paul's joke is somebody was making a Xerox copy and they cut off the last few words. But that's what we got.
So I want to touch on a little bit of the difference between the 2014 Farm Bill and the 2018 Farm Bill with this definition of hemp. And so I want to kind of set the stage with my position to some degree that basically it's undeniable that the intention between the 2014 Farm Bill and the 2018 Farm Bill was to explore a consumable cannabis market that was no longer going to be controlled. And the reason why I say that is because between 2014 and 2018, the change in the language of the definition of hemp went from strictly industrial to add in extracts, derivatives, cannabinoids, and all of the other with internal components of the plant and the things that can come from the plant besides just industrial purposes. So with the consumable piece and the piece of removing it and descheduling a portion of hemp or a portion of cannabis cannabis has never before been split between something legal and illegal. It was always illegal. And so now with the split, there's just such a mass amount of confusion about what is legal, what is not legal, what counts as marijuana, what counts as hemp. And there are no clear answers and they continue to change. And so what we do know is that hemp is federally legal and marijuana is federally illegal. And sometimes you're going to buy the same products or very similar products from very different markets. And what does that mean? What does that look like? How does it impact the state? How does it impact the patients, the consumers, the businesses? Let's talk about it.
Yeah, well, I think that the legality issue really comes into play. I mean, we all see the hemp market and how, you go into these stores and there's Delta 9 products, Delta 8 products, and there's very little enforcement insofar as, the Department of State Health Services doesn't have the manpower to really look into what's being sold in every single store around the state. We know that there's over 7,000 licensed retailers that are selling these things. And at the same time, though, what's really problematic is that in Texas, possession of marijuana is a misdemeanor. Possession of any kind of concentrate is still a felony. And so we have this situation where you still have people who can be arrested, can be prosecuted for possessing something that they thought was legal, that they bought at a store, that sold it to them legally, and that store profited off of it. And that to me is one of the most concerning aspects of this, is not just sort of the safety concerns around products, which is certainly big, but also this continued kind of just really nonsensical policy where we have people that are still getting punished for things that now we're also seeing legally sold in stores.
And this brings up a case recently with a young woman who was arrested.
Yeah, there was an excellent Dallas Morning News op-ed, and I was just scrambling my phone to find her name. I believe her name was Miss Reed, young woman. She's taken some pharmaceuticals for anxiety, doesn't like it. Someone tells her to try cannabis products, goes into a store, asks if this is legal. Yes, it is. Takes it. Her boyfriend comes to pick her up from work. Cop shows up. Boyfriend had been smoking weed in the car, so the cop questions him. Her vape pen's in the cup holder. Boyfriend gets busted for weed. She gets arrested for that vape pen. But officer, it's legal. I bought it in a store. They told me it was legal. It's Collin County. She gets charged, thrown in jail, loses a job opportunity. I mean, she's this young 20-year-old trying to start her career and get to a better educational situation, and got all these roadblocks thrown at her because of that gray area. She stumbles on a good lawyer, which is very lucky, literally walked into the first law office she saw and gets a lawyer who gets the charge dropped, but still collateral consequences to her. Mm-hmm. That's not fair. It's not fair to her. It's not fair to the shops. When we have gray areas in the law, it puts everybody at risk. And that's something we need to fix next session.
Any final comments on legality before we move on? So regulatory agencies, we know that the compassionate use program is regulated by the Department of Public Safety. Now, whether or not we think it should be regulated by the state police is another question. But that is a fact. The Department of Public Safety has regulated since 2015, and the hemp industry is regulated by a number of different agencies. Can you talk about that, Andrea?
Absolutely. So in Texas, there's a lot of, and there's actually been quite a bit of discussion this weekend in particular, but there's often discussion about the hemp-derived cannabinoid market as having no regulations. And I think it's pretty clear on this chart that there are regulations, especially in Texas. In Texas, the plants are, the authority over the plant growing and plant production is reserved to the Texas Department of Agriculture, and consumable hemp products fall under the Department of State Health Services. But as these are federally legal products, when they get into interstate commerce, they cross into federal jurisdiction. So we have United States Department of Agriculture that has requirements. We have FDA and FTC departments, or FDA and FTC, Federal Department of, or Food Drug Administration and Federal Trade Commission. This is about marketing, advertising, truth in labeling, what you're putting into your body. Is it safe? Is it effective? And these laws are on the books, and they do apply to hemp. So.
Yeah, they apply to hemp, but I think there's been a lot of criticism with the FDA because, the FDA has basically said that, we'll continue to issue, then they do this, they issue warning letters still for products where they say your product is illegally marketed, you need to do something about it. The warning labels are kind of just, they rely on voluntary compliance to a large extent. And the FDA has said that, we're not in a position to regulate hemp products. We need congressional authority or guidelines on this. And so they've, in some sense, punted. I think, as far as I can tell, the warning letters are still kind of the only main thing that they're doing around regulation. And then I would also just add with the DEA, I mean, this is another example of just this changing landscape, right? Where the DEA has tried to say that there's certain synthetics that are illegal, right? THCO being one of them. And the DEA has also said that HHC is illegal. There's a court case decided just the other day by the Fourth Circuit that said that the DEA has overstepped its agency authority and that actually THCO is legal, right? So that whole landscape is just constantly changing, and again sort of just adds to the confusion around what's legal and what isn't legal at the state level.
And the comment I have about that is what's happening in between. Agents, the plant touches a lot of different agencies. This industry touches a lot of different agencies. And if they're not coordinating, if they're not sharing information, teaching each other, talking to each other, it doesn't work. And let's take this tier with Texas, DPS with medical, TDA, dishes. There is hardly any cross communication happening among those three. And I'm going to throw a fourth agency in there, the Texas Medical Board. True anecdote. DPS figured out this spring that a doctor in Dallas who had lost his license for Medicare fraud, he was indicted federally, going to jail. Prescriptions kept coming through the system into Teacup for months under his name after his license was suspended. Because the medical board, which regulates doctors, didn't know to tell DPS, hey, and they didn't know which of their doctors were in Teacup. DPS had never thought about, maybe we should check periodically. These guys still doctors. Oops. And how exactly those prescriptions kept happening, I can't imagine the guy's criminal defense lawyer was letting him do that when he was looking at federal prison. But that's a problem. You've got to have agencies talking to each other, and the law is going to have to force that and fund that, or it ain't going to happen.
You bring up a really good point. It's not adding that about agencies talking to each other. We can't do that with DPS because the only regulatory agency is DPS.
Yeah.
Right.
And so there's that brings up kind of like this, and you'll see it in the rest of the chart. When you have these super high fees, you have one regulatory body, and you have very limited licensing. That type of structure is ripe for corruption.
It's also very opaque. People can't see what's happening. And I say that as a member of their working group.
Yeah, and you'll see it on here. There are things by practice that are not written anywhere that DPS is requiring.
That's a big problem.
No.
There needs to be consistency.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's talk about licensing, applications, fees, numbers. Since it was established, we knew that it was outrageous to have to pay nearly $500,000 for a medical cannabis license in the state, plus $315,000 every 2 years after that, not to mention the registering of all of your managers and directors. But we haven't seen that come down. We saw that it was considered and then not moved forward with. Let's talk more about the compassionate use program licensing. Go ahead, Susan.
Well, the original law said you must license at least 3 or enough for reasonable statewide access. DPS does some economic studies, publishes in the Texas Register. That number's got to be 12. And then they only give out 3. Those fees are so high because what they did is calculated what's it going to cost us to manage that program. Okay, now we're going to divide it by the number of licensees so that 3 is the denominator. If it had been 12, those fees would be 1/4 of that amount. As I'm sure many of y'all are painfully aware, DPS took applications for Teacup last year. People had to pay a license fee. They've got 132, and we got crickets for over a year.
Twice.
Yes, they have done this twice. Crickets. Now, as y'all may have seen in the prior programs, the Teacup program is hanging by a financial thread. The 3 licensees are not making money. They can't compete with the hemp market. Patients don't stay in the program because the product's more expensive, because it's more regulated. Just look at those numbers. It's like this. And then we have, and the hemp program was very purposely written this way: low fees, easy access. And the market spoke. And I think I've seen 7,000. We have 9,000 retail registrations. I'm sure there are others out there who aren't registered, either purposefully or out of ignorance. I was in a very fancy hotel in the Trans-Pecos, and they were selling THC drinks. A friend of mine managed it. I was like, hey, did you register with dishes? Am I supposed to do that? Yeah, you're supposed to do that. So it's whacked. It's so out of whack with each other, the differences between the two programs.
It's out of whack. And then also it really just highlights what's possible on the enforcement side. So like, just look at the application fees, right? On Teacup, they didn't give any licenses. They made $970,000 off of just the applications alone. And then if you look over here at the hemp licenses, right? I mean, a retail registration, $155 a year per location. I mean, you can make that in a day. I mean, half a day, an hour. So I don't know how you're supposed to be able to adequately enforce any of the regulations that are on the books with hemp when the licensing fees are that low. And so I think it's just this obvious, like such an imbalance, right? Where there's licensing fees that are just so astronomically high and then others that are too low to fund the program itself.
But I think it's also important to point out that lower licensing fees are lower barriers to entry. It allows for more people to get into the program. It allows for more people to operate businesses. It allows for more people to have variety of product choices. The lower the barriers to entry, the more equitable program you're going to have. And I think that's also very important and less likely to be corrupted.
Yeah, although then you also have more locations that then there's not enough resources to investigate. And so, or just to check up on. And I think, so to me, I think one possibility to, as far as the licensing structure is to have a tiered structure. And you see that with TABC, with the licensing structures where they have different fees depending on what kind of license you're applying for, what kind of business you are, how large scale you are, what your, annual sales are like. And that kind of tiered way of doing it is another way to ensure equity and entry into the market for lower, for smaller businesses while also increasing the amount of funding there for enforcement.
Looking at these fees, I think like a lot of these go to TDA and I know those are kept, but Dishes has some opportunity, I think, to earn some more money here that they're probably not doing and need to do to get more money for enforcement and for running the program. So it sounds like there's an opportunity for Dishes to get in there, maybe raise some fees, not too much, but do something to help support a program that they are expected to be taken care of.
Testing requirements. We had an excellent panel discussion on testing earlier from a kind of a big picture perspective. So let's talk about DPS.
Oh, yes. I find it mind-boggling that our state police are shipping samples from the medical cannabis program out of state for testing. We can't do that? What?
Our public safety department is
it's just like, and maybe I watch too much CSI and all those crime procedurals on TV. I'm addicted to them, but I thought y'all had fancy machines over there at the headquarters. Apparently not, or not enough. And testing is where the rubber meets the road on all of this. I've become more and more convinced about that. It has been remarkable to me that our medical program doesn't require third-party independent testing. Pre-harvest hemp testing does by statute. My colleagues here taught me over a Google sheet that my memory was wrong, that consumable hemp products do have third-party, but by regulation and the definition of accredited lab. And then I'm going to kick back to Andrea to talk about one of our favorite phrases, the by DPS practice, and then let's circle back to that part at the end.
Great.
Okay.
So with DPS by practice, right? So this isn't written in the policy, the rules anywhere, but understanding from talking to some of the licensees that they are required to routinely submit samples to DPS for that out-of-state third-party testing. DPS doesn't test in-house. And then they also have to send their products to DPS for approval, pre-approval before putting them out for sale, right? That's not written anywhere. I haven't seen it. I don't know if it's policy.
Employers apoplectic to have rules that aren't written.
Right. Nobody knows what they're supposed to do. And then, well, it's easy to do that because when you only have 3 licensees, there's not a lot of leverage to deal with the regulatory agency because they're hanging by a thread. So they can't push back because there's just such a difference in power of what can happen with their license and what can happen with their future and all the money they've already invested in here. On the hemp side, I was looking at this last night. You have to keep your records longer on the hemp side than on the teacup side. I
didn't.
Yeah, I saw it last night and I was like, oh wow. So. Again, for corruption, full panel self-testing and you keep it in-house. Nobody outside knows or has been able to confirm and check. There's like a lack of checks and balances in this teacup program and a lack of enforcement in this hemp program.
Right.
That's right. Well, I did do an open records request on the testing on the compassionate use program side. I also did one on the hemp side, and I got 6 emails since I've been here. She had to send 6 emails because there's so much data that it wouldn't fit all into any less than that. So I sent it to our expert, Yasha, to see what his insights are. And once I have a chance to dive in there, because I think that this is the most important part, like you mentioned, Susan, the most important part of this, we want to make sure that products are safe for consumers. And with the market being flooded with so many products from around the country, around the world, and without a regulatory infrastructure to really enforce the regs that are on the books, but also recommend new regulations that need to be there, I think that there's a risk for consumers. Thankfully, people aren't dropping dead from this stuff. It really is, it hasn't proven to be that dangerous, but we still need to have the infrastructure in place so that we can hold bad actors accountable.
Moving on to the testing. Are we get down there yet? Yeah, what do they have to test for? Full panel testing required. There is such a misunderstanding in Texas and around the country about Texas that it's completely unregulated here. But the problem, once again, is that there's a lack of enforcement. We do require full panel testing, not only on the plant, but on the finished products as well. But there's no enforcement.
Yeah.
Or there's a significant
Where's
lack
the
of
lab from? How do we know that? And there was a question before Senator Mendez is speak. How do we know, how I as a consumer know that the lab that this product was tested at is any good or not? You don't in Texas.
Well, yeah, and right, and there's been several kind of investigations where people have gone. I think Texas Monthly did this. There's been other activity where they go and you purchase products and you have it tested and it doesn't meet the state requirements. It's way above the Delta 9 legal limits, and that goes back to kind of the initial story that you were talking about the woman who was arrested, who the cartridge that she bought did exceed the state limit for Delta 9, right? So
how could a vape cartridge not exceed 0.3%?
Right. So that just, right. So these products, though, there's that lack of enforcement on the testing, and also the fact that the out-of-state products, while they are supposed to comply with state rules and regulations around the products, they're not tested by state labs. There's no oversight in Texas of out-of-state labs. And, from what I understand, a lot of the products that are on the market that fail to meet the state requirements do come from out of state. We get a lot of, products from California and from other legal states that, have their THCA or their kind of like leftover products that they're essentially selling in our hemp market.
So one of the things that we do in the hemp side with the testing, is that on the agriculture side, on the plant side, it's required to be tested. That your official sample test has to be tested by a Texas-approved lab, a TDA-approved lab. We don't have that requirement on the dishes side. And it doesn't mean you have to test it in a Texas lab. It just has to be a lab that is approved by Texas. Why is that not on the consumable side?
Well, and on the approval, all you have to do is be ISO certified. I mean, it's not like TDA is going and doing what Nevada does and testing the testers and seeing, is this lab legit or are they still doing things right? It's nothing.
I think this kind of goes back to that point that you were making earlier, Susan, about the lack of communication between the agencies, and just how when the hemp regulations were being developed, there's sort of, it was almost done completely separately and with no consideration at all for what the regulations have been in teacup or what the testing looks like on that side. There's just so much inconsistency between the two.
It also, the perception of agencies and the politics of agencies goes into that.
Right.
And what the legislature thinks of different agencies can change what ends up happening in a statute or a regulation.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
It mentions here full panel testing, but I remember when I looked at the things that we're looking for in the plant, what are we testing for? There was no list of residual solvents.
No.
Yeah, not on that side.
Is maybe one of the biggest dangers, because we have so many of these products that we're converting CBD into things like Delta 8 THC. How do we know that all of those residual solvents came out in that process, especially when there's not a requirement for that testing?
And DSHS has the authority to make rules around this. Why they don't put in like specifics? There is a chart in the rules about certain things. I don't think it does have residual solvents in it though.
Last night.
Yeah,
Heavy metals, pesticides, microbes. It's a pretty good.
And residual solvents that's for Texas. We need that.
All right, let's get to the big issue. The THC metric. Where Andrea and I are gonna arm wrestle on the stage about what this means.
Just a little bit, but I don't want to spend too much time on it. There's so much more, but we'll do it. We'll do it.
Or do you want to take that for the end?
If we save it to the end, I don't think we're going to get to it. But how important is it for what are we trying to solve for here, right? Like, what are we trying to solve for, not necessarily on this panel, in this industry with Texas between hemp and marijuana, right? What's the main goal?
Consumer protection.
I would think it's consumer protection. I would think so. But we don't see that in our legislature.
Public health and safety.
Yeah. Well, we also have to remember, that's right. And we have to remember that we're dealing with people who have no idea about cannabis.
Yeah.
There's a big learning curve for our regulators, and having people there to explain it to them, to build those relationships, people that they can trust, so that they can have insight into what's happening around the country, what's not happening in our state, and what do we need to put onto the book. So let's look at this as opportunities, not just failures, but opportunities for us to get in there and help to educate them.
Absolutely. But why don't we have mandatory education and training for people that are in the industry? Why don't we have doctors that require mandatory training for doctors, mandatory training for anybody doing sales, manufacturers, if you're converting products, mandatory training and education, law enforcement?
Yeah.
I mean, this should
Yeah.
there's the things needed to improve the program are not right. It's not rocket science, and they should not be controversial.
Yeah. Well, and let's also remember that while we have a regulatory infrastructure that's not meeting these needs, those things that you just mentioned, all of that testing can be done right now by the community. Somebody can start an organization, whether it's a company or a nonprofit, that offers this education. So at least the people who want it are getting it while we work on getting regulations up to speed.
And then show the state of Texas how it's done.
Exactly right.
Yep.
Facility requirements?
Yeah, or should we go ahead and do THC metrics?
THC metrics.
Go back.
We could do it.
Let's do it. All right. This is where Andrea and I were talking last night on the phone. She's driving back to Houston, and I'm outside a bar where it's a little quieter. And I'm like, this is it. This is where I'm not sure. This is where I think, I won't call it a loophole, but why our market has innovated the way it has. And it's what I finally began to understand last night is it's in the omission. It's in what we don't see. So plants, how do we test plants in the hemp program?
We know plants in the hemp program are tested using the total THC metric, which is adjusted for 0.877 THCA. Right, and this is because the THCA in the plant decarboxylates into delta-9 when it's,
Right,
through
and it
heating.
uses 12% of its mass. For those of you who remember high school chemistry, I barely do. But that is laid out in the USDA regs and the TDA regs. Copy it.
So, right, so it's, and that's a whole different discussion. It's not exactly in the definition in Farm Bill.
Right.
But TDA put it, not TDA, USDA put it in the rules. And then in the final rule, they actually changed the definition of hemp. So that's an interesting point too. But for the final products, in the federal side, we don't have testing guidelines for final products because it was kicked to the FDA and the FDA has just sat there. So we have no regulatory framework for safety and stuff like that outside of the FDA when it comes to the hemp products. But for as far as the finished products, if you read through the statute and the rules in Texas, there is no requirement for total THC or decarboxylation, post-decarboxylation meeting that adjusted THC.
Doing that math.
Yeah, it's acceptable THC hemp level. That's what you have to meet thoroughly in everything. And every time you look through the regs or the statute, it's acceptable THC, hemp THC level, which is 0.3% delta-9 THC.
And this omission is what answered a question that first came to me. When I first heard people were selling THC flower in Texas, I was like, sir, that's just weed. And I was like, how are people doing that? This is how people are doing this. It's because it's not pre-harvest testing, it's final product. And it's not laid out in black and white because we had a thoughtful, responsible government who thought about how do we regulate this. And the market innovates.
But I love that. The market innovates. That word is perfect. And it's actually so on point. And I'm going to come back to that in a second on the research point. But I wanted to get back to the total THC issue, because when this was almost a flip issue in the beginning, because the 2014 Farm Bill didn't require total THC. And so for the states that were still under the 2014 pilot program, until we went to a full 50-state total THC thing, they had the ability to
this little gap of opportunity.
And Texas couldn't do it because Texas had to do total THC before these other states did. Now everybody has total THC on the grow side, but not everybody has total THC on the finished product side. Some states do, some states don't.
Katie, we sucked up all the oxygen on that one.
Let's move on. Innovation, right? You mentioned the word innovation. I love the ability for hemp to remain legal because how are we going to say this? Hemp-derived cannabinoids, because of the research available and the opportunities to research that aren't held up in a federally illegal Schedule 1.
Nice point.
Yeah.
The opportunities you have to research these different cannabinoids and what they can do for health without having to be, handicapped by the government and the Schedule 1 stuff. I mean, that's so important. It's so important. And now is the opportunity for that, and make sure we tell them, don't shut it down.
Yeah.
Because then you lose the opportunity to treat patients, consumer safety.
Yeah.
That's why we want this.
And learning more about the 100+ cannabinoids that we know about now, the research that, Dr. Russo is doing, and more researchers are going to start doing once they start realizing just how easy it is to do that if you exclude THC from the equation.
It would be tragic to take this away from the scientific community.
Agreed. And consumers.
Consumers?
Facility requirements. Go ahead, Susan. Talk about general.
There's a lot more on the teacup side.
Oh, yeah.
I'll do the short answer to that. And including the buffer from schools and anybody who's got their shop next to a school is just asking to be called out in a Senate hearing in the legislature. That's a bad idea. It may be legal, bad idea.
That's what they're shutting down. That's what they're coming after. That's what these Allen DEA and Allen police raids are about, selling to underage kids.
Right. But that's like the one thing I think everybody can agree on that is an easy fix. It's the easiest thing to fix. And I think, and actually that to me is the thing that I feel like we're most likely to see happen is fixing on the age part without necessarily fixing many of the other things that need attention.
Any other notes on the facility requirements?
Well, the warehouse licensing. A lot of people don't realize when you're manufacturing and processing hemp, you are supposed to have, well, in some cases, and it gets tricky, but sometimes you're supposed to have more than just a hemp license. Sometimes you need to have a food storage or a food warehouse license, and those require CGMP to be met in most cases. There are people out here, tons of them, manufacturers and processors who aren't following CGMP, but we have no enforcement by DSHS coming in and checking on these to make sure that these products are doing what they are supposed to be doing according to our laws and regulations.
Mm-hmm. One thing I would add on the facility requirements, you see on the teacup side, right? They have requirements for the extraction system. And that's one thing that is really lacking, I think, on the hemp side. And so we have to remember that on the extraction part of things, right? We are talking about using very powerful chemicals and solvents and these processes that can be flammable and can be dangerous if it's not done in a proper environment by people that have proper training. And that's something that I think is lacking on the hemp side right now. That I think should be another thing that's addressed is looking at how the things are extracted.
There may be some OSHA requirements surrounding that, but I'm not sure. I mean,
there's people that are people make it in their house, and,
yeah.
You know what I mean? And there's right. And there's risks around that. I mean, if you don't know what you're doing or you just have some kind of accident with it, right? So.
Yeah, absolutely.
So coming back to the buffer zones around schools, there's schools everywhere. So how much of a buffer zone is actually reasonable?
I don't think 1,000 feet is unreasonable. Sometimes I see 500. I work in some other regulated industries and there's, sometimes 500, sometimes 300, but I don't think 1,000 is necessarily unreasonable. I'm not a business operator. Mm-hmm. If the business operators have a different opinion about 1,000 feet, make it known.
Mm-hmm.
One question I've had about the buffer zone, though, is if it would just apply to new businesses, right? Because there are so many currently. I mean, we have them in Houston that are very close to schools. I know it's in Austin as well. So how you deal with that? Like whether or not you grandfather in the ones that are already there, and it's
or maybe it's a phased out. Have a period of time to move or something.
Right. Is there a requirement on alcohol?
I don't know.
I do not know that.
Yeah,
I think there is.
What's the feet? Anybody know? 300.
300.
Thank you.
Thank you, AJ.
Yeah.
All right, inspections. I know that there's some inconsistency on the compassionate use side, and we've got an utter lack of resources to effectively do inspections on the hemp side.
Resources is also the ballgame, and this is another area that is so disproportionate. The teacup licensees are constantly inspected. I overstate slightly. And then, Texas forgot to really fund the enforcement of the hemp program. So they've just now upped it from 6 to 12 inspectors for the whole state. Initially, they did not have specially trained hemp inspectors. So you had guys showing up who were like, hey, what's this? Tell me about it. So,
Well, and that's kind of one of the things, like, this is just a question that I've had and I've wondered, and you had mentioned kind of the state politics around agencies and agency preferences, but whether there is just not a desire to provide DISH with that enforcement money. I don't know if that was just an oversight, I don't know. It's just a kind of a question, an open question to me, because I just don't see how you could think that originally 6, and now I learned that now they're going to 12, but how you could think that would be enough for this.
Well, I don't think when they set it up, they had any idea that the consumable hemp industry was going to do what it did. But now they do. And
right.
Going to 12 is working with what they've got, but we need them to be good allies in getting to the Capitol and really explaining what the situation is effectively to lawmakers so that they can do that. And, I think that we may get into it later, taxes, we'll touch on.
We'll get into, you have to think about governmental infrastructure. What does Texas already have in place where they can have the kind of reach that is statewide with thousands of licensees or registrants to inspect? It's alcohol and it's the comptroller's office because of cigarette taxes. They've got boots on the ground in the way no other agencies do. Maybe the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation has that many boots on the ground.
All right, we've got about 10 minutes, so I want to just, we're going to speed through these rest of us, be real efficient. That's what we'll do. Available products. This, of course, is a big deal. We have limited products on the compassionate use side and unlimited uptake methods for those who are using cannabis on the hemp side.
I'll jump right in. Distinction in the law, the teacup program bans, quote, burning, smoking is defined as burning. The hemp program, smoking is defined as burning or heating. That means you could legally vape flower in the teacup program. We all know that it's really important to patients to get that immediate onset of an inhalable. But the Department of Public Safety is not allowing the teacup licensees to sell any kind of inhalable product.
It'd be a game changer.
It'd be a game changer, and it's a crappy, horrible thing to do to patients, particularly little kids with seizures, anybody who's got any kind of rapid onset.
Well, we all saw the video with the Zartler family.
Yeah.
Giving it took 3 minutes for Kara, who has severe autism and self-injurious behaviors. She goes into these fits and episodes with self-injury. And they very bravely shared a video of them giving her, they used a volcano in the bag and to vaporize it, and gave her, a mouthpiece to do that. And it took 3 minutes for this very strong 17-year-old to completely calm down and come out of that fit of self-injurious behavior. It was incredible to see, so brave of the Zartler family at great risk to share that, to make sure that lawmakers are able to see what a difference it makes to have immediate uptake through inhalation.
And this is from a mother who has a child that is disabled and has lots of seizures, and you need this. This is a medical issue. It's not a people want to get high, and it's not just flower. It's vapes and nebulizers. That's out there. Why? And my understanding is DPS isn't wanting it. Why not? Why are we doing this to patients?
Any other comments on available products? Let's talk about the consumer base, age restrictions.
Another giant difference between teacup and the hemp program, and one that I think is increasingly important, is the supply chain. With the competitive supply chain, you get competitive pricing, you get better pricing for consumers.
Just right. I mean, the better prices, and I mean, also obviously, again, we've touched on it, but the age restrictions. And I know that there are, and this is good, right, that there are already a lot of, on the hemp side, businesses that have imposed their own age restrictions. And this is actually something that for some of them is required by the insurance companies, because more and more we're seeing insurance companies who provide insurance for this industry who put restrictions on them that are more stringent than what the state has, right, that require age checking, age verification, and also require on the product side more testing for products if they're going to sell them as their own brand. So I think that's just another interesting dynamic, is how that industry has also helped maybe rein in the hemp industry in ways that the state regulations haven't.
When I look at the comparison between these two charts, I see a feasible business model and an unfeasible business model. I see such unnecessary and strict limitations versus, a lack of guardrails.
Right.
And we go from something that's so regulated within the state to something that you can have an international supply chain. So one of the other, in addition to consumer safety, top priority, like it's an economic, issue, like jobs, taxes, money, businesses. A national and international supply chain is huge for that. And again,
But I have to take the opportunity to say that, we ultimately would like to see doctors being the ones who decide whether or not a patient can benefit from cannabis, not politicians in Austin. And at minimum, though, chronic pain needs to be added, and we hope to include that this legislative session. We know, we've talked about opioids throughout this legislative session. We know that they're addictive, they're dangerous, and that cannabis is a safe alternative for many patients. And so we're hopeful that we'll be able to get that through this legislative session in efforts to expand the compassionate use program. Packaging advertising standards. I think this is another one where there's a lot of common ground on the hemp side of things, making sure that young people, children in particular, don't have access to them. You find a package of gummies as a kid and you're not just going to have one. And that can,
Tasted good.
yeah. And that can lead to really some very scary experiences for young people. Thankfully, you're not going to overdose and die from cannabis. We know that. That's something really good to keep in mind, but we do not want young people going through the experience of it is an overdose. It's not a fatal overdose, but it is an overdose of cannabis, and it's very uncomfortable and scary, and it should not happen. And there's a responsibility that we have as individuals that have young people and pets in the house to keep it away from them. But also I think that there's some opportunity on packaging to make sure that it's not as easy for young people to open up these packages.
And when there's harm to children, you've got pissed off, terrified mamas, then pissed off mamas. And if you have pissed off mamas, you have an enormous political problem. And, I understand, California has cracked down on intoxicating hemp and beverages and all kinds of intoxicating hemp. And I understand part of the origin of that is the governor's teenager came home with a THC drink. And you pissed off a papa who happened to be the governor. And this is what happens.
Yeah.
And I also give a shout out to Robin Goldstein back there, the economist from UC Davis. And I think he mentioned this in the earlier panels. He said, we're not going to regulate this, require accurate labeling and enforce the hell out of it with huge fines, and you take care of most of your public safety problems.
Yeah.
let's talk about that, enforcing it with huge fines, because we have on our books already tools that could be used to enforce these, like deceptive trade practices, misbranding and adulterated products, false labeling, false
COA, yeah.
Yes, faking your COAs.
COAs, yeah.
Putting products out there that aren't safe for consumers. I mean, there's so many ways, and it is happening in other states, right? I think Nebraska, Iowa, and Colorado have had lawsuits brought against companies by the Attorney General for putting products out there. And there are civil lawsuits that have been happening, that a lot of them have settled, but and more will happen. And those are monetary, those will kill businesses. Just from the monetary and having being forced to settlement. It's not about necessarily criminal issues. And the lack of enforcement is ridiculous because they don't need more tools. They have them. They just need to use them.
Yeah, but they need the funding and the resources to do it. And that is a big issue that I think needs to be addressed during the session. And that question of how the enforcement is going to be funded.
Yeah.
One thing to note is we need to make sure we don't get too excessive with the packaging requirements like we've seen in other states.
Right.
Not only do individual packages need to be child resistant, but then the package that the packages are in also needs to be child resistant, and it ends up being so wasteful and unnecessary.
It's so ridiculous.
And then I can't open it.
Not a single overdose there, right? And the regulations that we are putting on these products for something that's not fatal, when we are missing those from things that are, it just doesn't make sense.
All right, let's talk about taxes. I'm going to let the attorneys talk about the taxes, actually. Go ahead.
Well, and I'll get the super nerd answer about distance for alcohol. It is 300 feet. unless the commissioner's court or the school district asks for it to be 1,000 feet. So it's going to, you have some locality variation in it. And thanks to the wholesale beer distributors lobbyist for
Yeah, I was like that.
letting text to print. Taxes. This is another where, and Andrea's line about viable business model, not viable business model. For those of you who don't know, 280E is a section of the Internal Revenue Code that prohibits the deductions of cost of goods sold, which is usually a big deduction for any business that sells things for, quote, marijuana distributors. So this is a huge reason why the legal marijuana industry struggles. Their taxes are enormous because of 280E. That can go away if the federal government and the DEA, which are holding things up on reschedules to 3. But big tax burden on teacup that you do not have on the hemp consumable side.
But the good thing is that patients don't have to pay taxes, which is important. And I think that we want to.
Yeah, medicine should never,
We
ever,
don't
ever be
want
taxed.
medication taxed.
That's right.
But then on the flip side, on the hemp side, because they're not Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 drugs, hemp has been descheduled, there's no 280 issue. They don't have that big tax hit, but we also only are collecting sales taxes on them. So we're talking about funding. And I'm not a proponent of taxation or overtaxation at all.
You're here.
However, we have to fund something. And I don't know what that amount would be, but like I absolutely would not, support something crazy. But because you also have to keep in mind getting people from, because the hemp market, you can convert people from the illicit market into a regulated market because of the low barriers to entry. But if you overtax it, you're going to screw that up. So
Well, as mentioned earlier, California is 2/3 of the market is in the illicit market in California. And that's because of the overregulation and overtaxation. It's easier to operate in the illicit market, brick and mortar, as they talked about earlier, and they pay the fines rather than paying the cost of compliance and paying the taxes. So that is so backwards, and we have to make sure that that doesn't happen here. We've already seen how pervasive the industry can spread, and we see that kind of stuff happening. How are we going to rein that in when people are being so bold as they are in New York?
well, I mean, it's bold here too.
It is.
In the cities. In the cities where there's too many other priorities to be focused on things that aren't killing people.
Yeah, there was a raid of a dispensary in Houston that had obviously had a bunch of product that was brought in from California. You can tell by the packaging when you're looking at it. Very pretty storefront. They had invested some money in that bricks and mortar and making it look nice. Dude didn't even bother to get a certificate of occupancy from the city of Houston. I mean, that's bold.
That's bold.
Yeah.
And probably perhaps some organized crime on something that fancy.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, so reasonable taxes on the adult use side, which is what the hemp industry is, what should be an adult use industry anyway, until we get those age restrictions, it's a fight. So reasonable taxes are going to help to fund the regulatory infrastructure. And I agree with what was said earlier on the taxation and regulation panel about not overdoing it on that. I don't think that cannabis should be a cash cow for the state of Texas. I think that it should be enough to cover efficient regulatory oversight and some of the maybe public education campaigns that have been talking about how to use cannabis responsibly. Our state has been stifling this industry for so long through prohibition. I think there's an obligation to help make sure that information is available so people can make good decisions.
And let me say something about revenue and messaging. And I've heard a lot of people say, why you think Texas would want to legalize marijuana? Because then we get all this revenue. Texas doesn't need the money. Our budget is $114 billion. And some lobbyists I was working with commissioned an economic study during the pandemic. There was about 6 months during the pandemic where there was some quiet questions asked behind the scenes when they were worried about sales tax revenue. Like, what would that look like? Did it? How much could we make? And so we got a study done. Quietly gave it to the right people. And the answer was, after 4 or 5 years, this was before the hemp market exploded, if you legalized, once your system ramps up, you could expect tax revenue in Texas as $500 million a year. That sounds like a lot of money. And it would be a lot of money for, say, New Mexico or Nevada, which are much smaller states. It's not for Texas. It's just not. And my experience lobbying on this in the legislature, money does not motivate votes.
Right.
What has flipped hard conservative Republicans who are like, I will never vote for that, I won't even vote for medical, is marching in a family, a patient,
Right.
tell their stories. And there was a student here earlier today who was doing this in high school who has Tourette's, and she was amazing. Like, she and her father could flip a hard-ass Republican vote in 20 minutes flat. And an issue that has come up in this conference that I think will be important to us going forward, and the senator brought it up, palliative care.
Yes.
And hospice, and letting people have some dignity in death and their families have some special moments in the fading of their loved one. That moves people. So for those of you who are hitting the Capitol and talking to your representatives, and absolutely do it, look up who your representative is. Mm-hmm. If you notice it's someone who just won a Republican primary who's going to be new, then it's especially important you go talk to them. Because odds are they're more conservative than not, more conservative than the Republican that was there before. Odds are they don't know anything about this. And when they hear from a constituent telling them a powerful story, that helps us get those votes lined up.
All right, final subject, the legally forced business model, the difference between compassionate use program and the hemp side. Vertical integration means that you have to do everything in-house. You cultivate, you process, you distribute. Alternatively is the non-integrated model, which is where you can get a license to do one particular thing. You can specialize in something. And was talked about earlier, it makes it much easier for people to get into the industry. You have to have a lot of capital and a lot of expertise in order to operate a very good vertically integrated operation. And I do think that the folks that are operating in our state are doing a very good job with that, but it's taken a lot of expense to be able to do it. And ultimately, we should have different licenses for different expertise. Any thoughts on this finally?
I agree with you 100%. I think it goes right to the incentive for corruption, down to, the ability, again, low barriers of access to entry and quality. Some companies are not good at everything.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Let the companies that are the experts at that thing be the expert at that thing. Let the market work out who are the good ones and who are the bad ones.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say that and it goes back right to the whole equity idea of it, because then you don't have this monopoly over the whole piece of it, and people can get in on one piece of the pie and just do that part of it. And so I think I think it can also make the market more resilient, right? Because then you have different people who can do different things. And so you're not so reliant on a handful of businesses that have to do the whole job themselves.
Yeah.
And product diversity is good for everybody,
Right.
good for consumers, good for patients.
Absolutely. And, and just reiterate how much it makes my attorney head spin that we have unwritten rules in this program. You have to be vertically integrated, but you can only operate by a single location. That is not in law. DPS made it up, and they have not the 3 licensees have been asking and asking and asking. So they're making them go through this asinine, wasteful, frankly, security risk situation where they have to drive their product from the mothership to their branches or to doctor's offices. It's hard for patients to get product, drive it back through Texas traffic. That's secure compared to having it in a locked building every night because they don't want to and they've made it up. And the Attorney General has issued an opinion on this and said, no, that's not required. They still will not relent. Tell me why you're not sabotaging this program. Because that's what that looks like to
The
me.
requirement is for state access.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's right.
Right.
Where we pick up, and if we can't make it, we might run out of medication. And
Well, I'm going to love on Good Blend because during last session, Good Blend was opening, and Terrence is here in the audience, opening I'll call it a drop location. It wasn't really a dispensary in Austin on Riverside. And I caught the end of their little opening party. And I know this everybody's packing up, but Terrence was nice enough to walk me around the parking lot to show it to me. And when we came back into the store, a woman was in there who'd walked in the door while everybody was around back. It was 5 o'clock, horrible Austin traffic. She was frazzled. She was, asking to fill her prescription. Terrence explains it's gone back to the ship. And I thought she was going to have a nervous breakdown right then. She had driven from Marble Falls through the traffic because she was out. She could feel her condition coming back. She had tried to drive another day to get it and couldn't get it done. And Good Blend called and had someone bring some back to her so she could go home with her prescription filled. She shouldn't be having to go through with that.
That's right.
And good on Good Blend for making it work for her that day.
When you order a delivery to your house, it takes weeks for it to come.
It turns out it's a big state to try to cover everyone.
Especially folks in North Texas.
Yeah.
We have these ice storms, and now we can't get to them, so we're putting our drivers at risk to try to get up there to North Texas, or to Houston, or wherever. And it's also putting the patients at risk to try to get their medicine. So
Yeah.
super challenging.
I hope this is the last winter that you have to do that.
But you still have I-35.
Yeah. We've got time for a couple quick final comments. Dr. Harris, I want to start with you. And if you wouldn't mind mentioning the policy report and recommendations that y'all are planning to put forward.
Sure. Yeah. So we are working currently. We put out sort of a short brief during the interim when the State Affairs Committee was meeting on this issue. But we are going to be putting out some recommendations that really focus, for us, I think our main concern is balancing, the public health goals, right? Protecting consumers, having a market where we have products that are safe for consumers, while also just, acknowledging the realities that this market exists, that there's a demand for these substances, and that a ban, which, some people, Charles Perry being one of them, like that certainly seem to want that, looking and reminding people of the dangers of going in that direction, right? And just the ineffectiveness, and also how harmful it would be to consumers. And so the report that we're putting out is going to kind of focus on those issues and put out some recommendations in terms of what we would like to see done. And, our position really is that long term, what we should be moving towards is sort of a kind of cannabis oversight agency, right? That's completely dedicated to cannabis oversight, that includes marijuana and hemp, that doesn't separate the two, and that is modeled, somewhat after TABC, right, with the Alcohol and Beverage Commission, that has a workforce that's devoted to that issue. I mentioned earlier kind of like the tiered structures for licenses, right, that can allow for equity and also fund enforcement. And so we expect to put that out in the fall ahead of the start of the session, and, we'll be happy to share it widely. But yeah, I just, I have, again, that, sort of kind of cleaning up the imbalances between the two markets. And then also, again, on the decrim side, continuing to push for that, because even though we have these products and they're in some ways legal, we also know that people are still getting arrested. And so continuing to push on the penalty reduction. And those are sort of some of the goals that we have, while also being cognizant of the realities of the Texas legislature and, what is possible there. But I'm so encouraged by all of the expertise that we have in the state. It's visible in this room, and also the passion around the issue.
I want to kind of focus on what are we going for? What is the aim for this session? And my thought is that it's consumer safety, right? That's what we keep talking about. But it seems like we're trying to control the ability for people to get high. And I don't know if anybody knows what that means for cannabis. Or I don't know if there's not a dividing line. Right? Because what are you trying to control for if you're trying to stop me from getting high? What does getting high mean? Does it mean I'm getting alleviation from my pain? Does it mean I'm getting a good night's sleep? Does it mean I'm able to come down from some anxiety or panic attack that I'm having? Right? Does that mean I'm high? Mm-hmm. And if we're not getting high from it, if we're trying to control people from getting high, why don't we put that, what is like guaranteed to get high? I'm not sure. I think that we are not focusing on what needs to be focused on, and we're putting forth nonsensical things that don't stay true to consumer safety. And I want to say that I think it would be a huge mark on Texas Congress this session if they fail to reasonably expand the TCUP program and properly regulate the hemp program. Mm-hmm. I feel like that would be complicit in the continued suffering of countless Texans, not just patients, but businesses, jobs, public health, tax money, economics. I think it's a huge issue, and I really hope this session that we can get to some viable pathways for every aspect of this industry to continue to prevail, or to begin to prevail for the ones that have been held back. But I don't want to see bans.
I'm going to lay out what's going to be really hard about this session, but why I still have hope. we have leaders of the House and Senate who really don't like each other.
Yes.
The lieutenant governor and the speaker hate each other's guts.
Yep.
And there's a bunch of other people running for speaker right now, but the numbers are such, I'm almost positive Speaker Phelan comes back, who has no real problem with cannabis. And it is causing great stress among the lobby about, well, if you've got a bill and you can have, the right people behind it in the House to pass it, then the Senate's going to want to kill it just because the people they don't liked it, and vice versa. So how the hell do you pass any bill in Texas? But this issue is perhaps the last bipartisan issue left. And you see that in who co-sponsored this event today. It's people on all sides of the political spectrum. They've got to hear that. And they've got to, because of who's in power of both houses, they particularly have to hear it from the Republican side, the Libertarian side, as Senator Menendez said, the messengers that they don't expect. Little old ladies, older military guys, people who they think who look like they could go to that senator or representative's church. That's who they need to hear it from. And they need to hear it over and over and over again. There's got to be buzz. Last session, the feel was cannabis. People just weren't talking about it. And there's got to be buzz. We got to keep taking to them that the system is broken and you have to fix it now, or you're not going to like what you see and you're going to harm everybody.
Well, cannabis brings the buzz.
Yeah. Boom. There you go.
So we have 4 months until the legislative session begins. I encourage you, do not wait until the legislative session begins to get active and engaged with your legislators and the candidates who are seeking to represent you at the Texas Capitol. When it convenes in January, we have 140 days to get a bill across the finish line. It's a lot of work that's going to happen. You can't just show up to testify when the bill is up for consideration. You have to have done the work in advance. We're kickstarting that now. A lot of us haven't ever really stopped. It's a continuing process, and I appreciate the opportunity to work with so many people from different perspectives and a variety of life paths and political beliefs. It really goes a long way in helping to move this forward. I'm optimistic about the 2025 legislative session, and I'm so grateful that you've all been here, the support that we've gotten from all of our sponsors, all of our volunteers that helped to make this event possible, and I thank you for attending the Texas Cannabis Policy Conference.
Thank you, Heather, for putting this on.
Thank you, Heather.
Thank you.